Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, good early evening, or morning for those, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining us for another Lubalin lecture in the Herb Lubalin lecture series here at TypeCulture, which is a typeface design program, and actually a little bit more than that, but a program that is part of Cooper Union. My name is Alexander. I'm a curator in the Herb Lubalin Study Center and one of the instructors at TypeCulture. And we're both presenting this lecture series. So welcome to another talk. We have first and foremost, would love to thank TypeCulture for allowing us to record this lecture and to add to our extensive growing archive of lectures that we have going back several years. So thank you, TypeCulture, a wonderful resource to the type community. So for those who are not familiar, do check them out. You can find previous lectures that we've had in our video archive in two places. It's on the website for TypeCulture lecture series, the Herb Lubalin lecture series. So if you go to that page, you can see the lectures that are coming up, but you can also see the talks we've had in the past. And clicking on most of the lectures in there will show you the embedded video for those talks. So we have a great collection there, and also on our Vimeo channel. So vimeo.com/CooperType takes you to the lectures, and there's a mix of Herb Lubalin lecture series in collections, as well as the typographics lectures, which is a annual conference that is coming up. Our 9th edition of typographics is coming up in the middle of June this year, so do check that out. And hopefully you can join us in person or remotely. We have 2 more lectures coming up in this spring term of TypeCulture, and we will have 4 more lectures in the summer. The next talk is next Monday, also virtual. It will be a Zoom webinar. It will be at a slightly different time. So we kind of try to alternate the time. So we have, this is a 12:30 start for us in New York, and the lecture on Monday, next Monday, will be at 6:30. And the talk is Artificial Typography. It will be presented by Andrea Campos and Martina Zambuja. It's focusing on the project that they had done, kind of creating type using artificial intelligence technology. And the talk that will close out the lecture series on April 10th will be a talk by Alexandra Samolenkova called Having an Accent in Type Design, focusing on kind of the design of the diacritics and sort of this idea of accents within letter making. So don't miss that. It'll be the same time as this talk, so at 12:30 New York time on April 10th. If you wanted to register to any of these talks or any of the, you can also sign up for the mailing list, but you can go to this link, coopertype.org/lectures. You can see everything that we have coming up. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's talk and today's wonderful presenters. The talk focuses on typography and type design, but of course it's kind of very important, I think, as time reveals to us the relationship of design to politics. It's I think inextricably linked, and we can't really talk about one without the other. I think also very importantly the idea of culture, and especially so in time of war. I think culture becomes a focal point, and certainly becomes a focal point for an aggressor, which I think is very obvious aggression happening right now, with a very serious attempt at creating a very different narrative, but also very much focused on erasing one particular culture. So I think it's important to kind of have these conversations, and I'm really delighted that we have a talk that will kind of delve into that. So I'll introduce today's presenters. Yevgeni Anfalov and Oleś Gergun are co-founders of the Kyiv Type Foundry, KTF for short. It's a retail and custom type foundry, which focuses on opening new perspectives on Cyrillic-based heritage. The foundry is based in Kyiv and Hanover. The two presenters with us today, I have Yevgen and Oleś. Yevgen is a designer based in Kyiv and Hanover. Was born in Kyiv, Ukraine, and in 2003 moved to Germany. He studied visual communication at Hanover University of Applied Sciences and Arts and began his design practice in 2010. He completed his MA in art direction at ECAL, the University of Arts and Design in Lausanne, in 2017 with a major in type design. His practice as a type designer grew out of his activities in the fields of visual design, alongside research in design history and his practice as a teacher. His first font, Heimland, was published by Line 2 in 2020. And since then, he has published Yermilov, Rublina, and Compact through KTF, the Kyiv Type Foundry, as well as Line 2's Atomgrad. The second presenter today, Oleś Gergun, is a digital designer and developer based in Kyiv and Leipzig with a background in cultural studies. He holds a Master's of Arts degree in Culturology from Kyiv Mohyla Academy. He's a self-trained graphic designer through his interest in creative coding. In his practice, he applies both design and code for commercial and non-commercial clients. He brings this analytical and strategic approach to KTF. His type design practice is a continuation of his Kyiv Type Digest blog, an ongoing research of vernacular typography in Kyiv. You'll see a bit of that in today's talk as well. His typographic debut is a contribution to the KTF Yermilov typeface. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Yevgen and Oleś to the stage. I will let you guys take it over. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Cooper Union team for such an opportunity, and hello everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm gonna start a little bit with a background story of how Kyiv Type Foundry started. It started before this war started, and it was in 2020 that we went online, and with the 3 releases of us, and we met with Oleś in Berlin, and shared common interests in design, typography, but also in other disciplines, I would say. And so, yeah, ever since many things have happened, and I'm very grateful for you to Cooper Union to give us an opportunity in these times, because it's of course the agenda, the political agenda is of course quite dark, but by introducing our practice, as Sasha mentioned, it's always, we can't really avoid the topic of the current war. So the war still goes on. But yeah, let's dive into this talk. So the QR code that you see is the link to our Instagram page. And so today's talk is going to be more or less structured based on the geography of Kyiv. And this geography in particular will be the geography of Russian barbaric destruction of the city. Since the 24th of February 2022, we witness Russian brutal attacks all over Ukraine. And as we both are tightly bound to the city we grew up in. I mean, I grew up, I was born in Kyiv. Oleś came a little bit later in his young adult times, but we, of course, it was very emotional to us to witness this all. And so today, this time, the narration is going to be about different artifacts of the typographic landscape. But the entry points into these discoveries will always be the places of either Russian missile attacks or some other weaponry they used during the siege of Kyiv last year. So yeah, now I'm giving the floor to Oleś.
Let's start with that slide. Yeah, again, thank you all for joining our lecture. My name is Oleś, as Jenny mentioned, yeah, and I'm the one of two guys working at KTF. That is an acronym for the Kyiv Type Foundry. Actually, we wanted to start this the story related to the theme of our lecture. It actually just happened while I was preparing for it. Approximately a year and a half ago, I was browsing through a flea market in Kyiv, and a certain book caught my attention. It was dedicated to a sisterhood of Kyiv and Leipzig, and I was struck by this beautiful lettering on the book cover, particularly with the play between the Cyrillic V and Latin G there, that were just simply vertically flipped. And we also noticed the interesting aspect there that is on the second slide here, that actually the letter A, the letter E in the word Leipzig is actually as well vertically flipped letter A. So actually, after some time, I found myself in Leipzig because I escaped war from Kyiv, and I'm living right now in this city. And when I was scrolling through these photos, I stumbled upon the picture, on this picture, and I was embarrassed actually and unsettled when I found the time and date code for this photograph. And it was written there that it is 23rd of August, 2021. And actually, if we calculate and do some math, it's right exact half a year ago before the war started. Again, the war started on February 21st. So I know it sounds a bit kind of like esoteric and kind of like as historical determinism and so on, but for me, it felt like, I don't know, like universe had sent me a message back then. And looking back, I understand that even in the darkest of times, there is a meaning to be found. And perhaps my journey from the beloved city of Kyiv was meant to be. And now I give the floor back to you, Jenny.
Yeah. I mean, this book says a lot, already gives you an idea of how this typographic, frivolous typographic enthusiasm looked some decades ago, which is still in the spirit of the city. But let's go back to the 24th of February, 22. My wife traveled to Kyiv one day before the war started, unfortunately, because of some family circumstances, and she had to escape this war. So it affected our family on a very, very personal level. When I woke up on the 24th of February, it was dark. And then in the news, I read a couple of things about the neighborhood I grew up in, and I was like, what the hell? And I've seen this image, for example, and this is the area where I spent a lot of time when my parents were busy working. And it was one of the early targets and early news. So the missile was shot down. Nobody was hurt or killed. But of course, it was a big shock, and I was paralyzed, and my wife was there. Speaking about this neighborhood, I know almost every corner of it, and of course, if this destruction happens within the range or in the place you tightly associate with this, it's of course a very tough thing. The building on the right, there is a little lettering saying Kinozal, which is like a movie hall that says a lot about this area. It's the area where the movie industry was situated, and this particularly this area is related to Dovzhenko studios. And here was the film printing factory from the 1948 onwards. And when this medium of film became obsolete, another institution, a big film archive, moved in, and it was 1994. And ever since, this archive stores the richest archive of Ukrainian cinema. A lot of titles not even restored, so real treasure for the movie culture in general. So a lot of children animation films, B-movies, scientific documentaries that's been produced during the decades ago are stored there. And this is like how the building looks like, which represents a little bit like the post-Soviet, postmodernist or postmodernist architecture. Pretty interesting. Also, kind of symbolic that there is this LED advertising somehow. Shabbily integrated into the facade of the building, which is quite symbolic, also quite common for Kyiv environment. So things like this are stored there. And for us as typographers, these are of a big interest, of course, because movie titles, opening titles, they carry a lot of information coming from this time of handcraft, where artists were actually drawing these titles on a special occasion. And sometimes I remember these times where we had a lot of many discussions with Oleś. It was these times where a lot were full of this drawing, art pour l'art. So for the sake of drawing. So we've been, just collecting these letters, tracing them and testing them out as typefaces. So obviously through this process of distillation, you get rid of the aura, of this aura of the original. And this is how we more or less got into what we do now. And so this is a little glimpse into what one of the modes we are hunting for, or the sources we're hunting for. Now, the next slide, I think it was the next week or a couple of days after the full-scale invasion has begun. I think in that time my wife made to the border, but of course we were all magnetized. We were all bound to the screens to see the news. And Oleś was also on the way to escape. I think you've been then in the Western Ukraine in this time. It was a missile attack, a missile that was targeting that hit the residential building. Actually, that happened a lot, and even though this state, the Russian officials always said that they've been targeting the military infrastructure, but the people, the residents of these buildings are suffering the most. And was also pretty visual because the building is huge. It was in the daylight. It happened in the daylight. Now, the address of this the avenue the city the building is located in is Valery Lobanovsky Avenue, which is carrying the name of the most known trainer and ex-Dynamo Kyiv player. I'm sure many of you know what Dynamo Kyiv is. And so 1927 is a crucial year for that, for this, to make this, to bridge this gap, or to make the bridge from this place to the context, a little bit of a context, that the name of Valery Lobanovsky gives to us, because Valery Lobanovsky was training Dynamo Kyiv. Now, Dynamo Kyiv was found in 1927. 1927 is also important because my only true Kyiv branch, Granddad Misha, was born in this year too. And finally, in 1927, so this is the picture of Lobanovsky and the logotype of Dynamo Kyiv, which is still the same. And in 1927, there was a novel published called Misto, which is translated into English, which is The City, translated into English. Now, this novel is considered to be the first modern novel in Ukrainian or urban novel in Ukrainian literature. And I read this book quite recently, and in this book, it's quite funny. First of all, this novel opens up the whole world. I was not really familiar too, but it's very important because it's actually the generation of our grandfathers and grandmothers, and we try to relate to them, and sometimes we have these questions: what would I do in their circumstances? Would it be bearable for me to even sustain and live through what they lived through? And so, but here, 1927 is still like full of hope for the Soviet citizen. So the protagonist Stepan is coming up the river Dnipro to study in Kyiv. He comes from the small village. Probably he comes from, I don't know, from Kherson, from this area around Kherson or some mid Ukraine. And so he wanted to study economics. And the whole book tells actually this story of him, all of a sudden becoming interested in literature and becoming a famous writer. And so the beginning of this novel is really interesting for me. Like, I have to fantasize about this scene, like an opening little scene where he looks into the bookshop and looks at book covers. And for him, it's like overwhelming, not in a positive way. Maybe for me or Oleś, it would be like a colorful sensation, full of design, and but for him it was as he was in Kyiv, arriving in Kyiv to study, he was not sure. So all these titles are overwhelming and unknown, and he's afraid of himself not being educated enough to accept the challenge of studying in the megapolis. So he is quite hesitant, but then he decides to stay in the city to continue, and he eventually he gets even famous. Now, this bookshop situation is, of course, something that interests us in terms of hunting for the sources, and one of the most beloved places to visit for us is, of course, Petrivka market, where you see a lot of where you have an opportunity to actually to browse also through the books coming from 1927. But also speaking of this 1927 thing, of course, it points out our field of interest. So we are particularly interested in the Soviet period of design history, and we've been asked about it in our previous interview for Ukrainian design magazine Telegraph, and we reply where does this Soviet period come from and why? And we replied, and I replied that I was interested in this paradoxical nature of modernism, with its obsession to create an ideal. And in our history, in Ukrainian history, modernism is not to blame for the fact that it happened in the Soviet Union. And I mean, you can't really ignore that it happened. It just happened. And as the saying goes, you can't throw words out of the song. I don't know what's the equivalent in English speaking culture, but I hope you get the idea. And so in 1927 is my personal opener into the generation of my granddads and grandmothers. And, the protagonist and also the author of this Misto book, back in 1927, little he knew about the fate of his novel and of his own, because he was then executed. He was, when Stalin came to power, he was one of the repressed writers in Ukraine. So he ended up being killed. And so many and this just to recall what times came shortly after this 1927 year. And here we'd like to talk about Yermilov, which is Oleś, mostly Oleś topic. And yeah, please.
Yeah, it's a natural continuation of the modernist story. Actually, here you have the UAV of Russians that hit the building on Podil district. That is quite a famous district in Kyiv, because it's an ancient one, and I've lived there for 15 years, and for me that picture is quite sad, because I know the streets, I know the people who are living there, and sadly, Podil became the victim of the Russian aggression. But overall, if we go further, I remember how I was walking there just to spot some sign entrances, entrances signs on the street, and I was always thrilled how simple those designs were, and how powerful they were also. And at the same time, I saw that as a culture studies Master of Arts, that it's a strong and unique identifier for our national visual DNA. And what's more, it seems like nobody paid attention to it. So designers just ignored that kind of style, and overall those entrance signs were removed with time. And I saw that as my duty, just to save that perhaps on film. So one day, Jen and I were walking around Podil, and we just start talking about how cool it would be just to create our own constructivist font. inspired by famous work of Vasily Yermilov, who was the prominent Ukrainian avant-garde designer who worked in the 20s especially, and whose legacy is de facto still present on the streets, and I hope, and Jenna hopes, that it will never disappear. Frankly, drawing that typeface for me was kind of a loss-making enterprise, but I knew I had to do it because nobody did it before. And I'm sure this legacy had to be respected. But over the time, like in a year and a half, this typeface unexpectedly became kind of popular in Ukraine. And it was later used for a world-renowned media campaign for supporting Ukraine. It was made by the Ukrainian ad agency Banda. And in some sense, our typeface became like symbol of the Ukrainian bravery. That is actually is written here on the slide. And for me, especially the Ukrainian endurance. So we stay all together and support Ukrainian army, and we support as designers. And we are glad that history gave us this opportunity to do this.
Also, it was a historical justice to Yermilov, because Yermilov was that kind of, he was a prolific figure. I mean, studying, I'm gonna go a little bit back to here's his portrait. And yeah, that's a good one. Even though he was a prolific figure in the Ukrainian avant-garde movement, the officials, the Soviet officials, tried to ban him from various activities, and he had really he had many troubles. But he was lucky not to be sent to Siberia. He was someone who survived this Stalinist terror and somehow got forgotten. He was teaching. He was a brilliant teacher in Kharkiv. When he started his career, Kharkiv was actually the capital of Ukraine, and a lot of artistic life was happening there. And for me personally, it was also, and for Oleś, it was very important to give to. So we started by drawing a replica of his lettering, and because he used this letter A and this proportion so rigorously throughout all his career, we became like obsessed with how come, like well, first of all, about him as a designer, and then about the second layer of look around, like I've seen it somewhere else, and then we go back here, and then it's part of the city landscape somehow without being Yermilov's legacy. And so it's rather us who connected it, but it has its logic, as you see, like the 3x4 grid, 3x6 grid, sorry. And then this letter A coming from the avant-garde magazine. It was an artistic group. He was part of an artistic director. This all comes together, being unique for this letter shape, but also quite a generic one. So I remember you Oleś said about that modernism on the post-Soviet terrain becomes ugly, and it's something about decay and something that's really pushed aside and not really wanted to be seen. But that's actually the opposite of how we see it, because it's for us, we say we blow away the dust from it and we revitalize, but we also get rid of this of the age, of the time aspect, and then all of a sudden all of a sudden, you see the typeface being used in the right context. So somehow there is a lot of how would you call, like it's an enlightening moment. Like there is magic in it, and so when the designer, when it comes to the right place in the hands of the right designer. There's been even an aircraft carrying, and it still flies, carrying this lettering, which as part of this campaign. And here I would like to make a little remark about, or a little transition from this rather, well, let's say industry-oriented or production-oriented typeface into a vernacular. So what I want to say is that according to Constructivist program, lettering and typography were meant to be handled by people that were not specifically trained as typographers. So Constructivism is rooted in the idea that everybody could be a designer. So they came up with manuals of how to produce the simplest block-alike typefaces, not the block typeface, but the things that could be assembled from modules, like from the, let's say, from the blocks or from the rectangles. And so nowadays, so Constructivism is rooted in the idea that everybody can be a designer. And nowadays in Kyiv, everybody is a designer with his or her own notion of what designing actually is, and sometimes it's in a very exotic way. And so assembling basic forms and celebrating materials that are right at your hands is an essential part of creative undertaking nowadays. And after 100 years, we see these constructivist typefaces, fonts or letterings or creations produced into a current in the current DIY style that I call street constructivism, but this is just my subjective turn. So long live street constructivism, and yeah, let's get into the topic of vernacular then.
Yeah, so I researched that when I was living in Kyiv. And when I was researching it, I developed love for vernacular and especially non-commercial typography, that is so prevalent in post-Soviet Ukraine. I would often wander the streets with camera and searching for interesting signs and slogans outside. And as for me, they captured the spirit of the city. There was something about those hand-painted signs, if we look back in retrospective mode, that actually spoke on more kind of a deeper level. If we take a look on the economical and political situation in Ukraine, those letterings appear in a different light. Actually, we can see it more as a reflection of creativity and an ingenuity in the face of, let's say, economical hardship and other uncertain situations. When I was researching that specific part of typography, I've noticed that we can group them into three main groups. So actually right now on the screen, you see the highlighted example of the first group. That is a remake of a font from memory. So the author remembers some font they see somewhere in the book or on the streets, and they just used like a super minimalistic, simple tools to recreate it. And they try to recreate it as much as they can. For example, this example was found by me. The original typeface was found by me on the wall in Leipzig. And unfortunately, I couldn't manage to take a photo for this lecture. lecture, but I found the original version. And if we take a look here, it's pretty interesting that the designer used just a paintbrush to recreate a typeface that reminds Fraktura, black letter, or this kind of fonts. So
a very weird Fraktura.
Yeah, and came to some strange type and creative moves, decisions there. Yeah. So the second group is a font created from a blank sheet. It reminds us the practices of graffiti as a street art practice. So the main point here is just to capture the creative vision and to capture the attention from the customers that are walking on the street. If we take a look on this slide, it's pretty visible that those kind of letters are too creative for the advertisement. And we see that there is no actually precise reference here. And let's name those person as a designer, they choose art or the commercial purpose. So we see more creativity here than will to sell something. So for the third group, we could take, this also a very nice example here, how just interesting play between the outside form and inside counter forms are playing. And it's just selling холодный kvass in Russian. It's the cold beverage. Yeah, and in the next slide we have the same play of the square counter form, the square form
outline and round counter form.
That was put inside the grid. The typical post-Soviet grid that is in form of tiles on the buildings of the neighborhoods that are called sleeping neighborhoods. In Ukrainian, it's a spalny rayon. So it's very interesting how the designer worked also on that. So maybe he failed to draw the numbers with right and strict lines, and they just choose to make circles inside.
But this, the 0 and the 8 are beautiful. Yeah,
and the third group is just an echo of a communist age, and it's just an interesting story and a transitional story for our second chapter. The main part here is that these signs are often created by older designers who remember a time before digital fonts. And we can spot here some creative moves that contemporary designers will never choose to do. And for us, that is like a decaying tradition we want to preserve, and just to take a snapshot and then maybe recreate in some interpretation with time. So we all perceive some information, especially graphic information, that is kind of lowbrow differently. And for me, it is crucial to tell how we perceive this kind of visual information and how Ukrainians perceive that, and what is common in it. So actually, we all know that irony and humor is a traditional mechanism to deal with difficulties and just to enjoy life. As one of my friends told me, like, Oleś, you either live with a sense of humor or with a psychotherapist. So also, it's a quite traditional way to the irony is a quite traditional way to demonstrate kindness, openness, and sincerity in the Ukrainian culture. And by the way, those traits are considered the most valuable in Ukrainian culture. And this sense of creativity and humor in Ukrainian culture is noticeable everywhere. So it's folklore, it's art, and it's as well typography. So people actually are laughing and having a good time when they are creating those vernacular type examples. It's very interesting that it's quite different in Europe, especially to clean European typographic landscape, and especially comparing to German typographical landscape where I'm living right now. So every time you go outside for a walk in Ukraine, you feel as if you're in the gallery. So the letterings are as well like having the traditional commercial design, are often made with fun and joy, as well as vernacular letterings. So to make the customer constantly entertained. And there is a good example. We just found this screenshot from the newspaper from the 60s that is saying Ukraine is laughing. It's Ukraina смеется. That is actually it's a nice illustration for that kind of modus operandi. You have to perceive that style and attitude to letters. So here, one moment also is very important, that the word Ukraine, you see that it is kind of Helvetica folio kind of lettering, but it has its own style. We have this more humanistic P, that is Cyrillic R. We have this interesting K letter and so on. And our next story is actually about those tradition to replicate the typefaces that were sold in the Western Bloc only by hand, by Ukrainian designers. So this is actually the Lukyanivska metro station that was unfortunately shelled by the Russian army, and as I know, it was shelled even with the field reactive artillery. And this spot is quite significant for us and symbolic, because we spent some time here for making designs for the Kyiv Biennial. So we as KTF made a custom typeface called Ekran that actually was inspired by those kind of letterings that we shown you on the page where Ukraine was laughing. So yeah, there was a big tradition in the Soviet Union of making replicas of popular Western neo-grotesques, and back then it was prohibited to use or buy the fonts from the Western enemy bloc. So the designers had to draw them and make the Cyrillic version by themselves with their own unique calligraphic flair, which left us a big source of creative moves and discoveries. So here we have the posters with this version of the typeface, and here is just a small note here that historically, just if we look at this situation ironically, actually, those Lukyanivska metro station was shelled by historically the same force that limited our access to Western typefaces.
Yeah, that's a very important thing to mention. The whole history of the Peter reforms, but also the pre-Peter events that happened to to Ukraine. For me, and this, you told me today that it was field artillery shelling this area. So I was really surprised and shocked about it. So it was already in the range of Grad, and I'm sure many of you know what Grad is. Grad was used by the Soviets in Afghanistan. It's a really brutal, reactive artillery that actually burns things to the ground. And here somehow, here the top of the building of Artyom plant formerly, not nowadays. So it's nowadays it's office. These are offices. So there is a destruction. There was a destruction in Kyiv going on all the levels, and that the fact that they've been so close is so, of course, terrible. But going back to this font, I just want to comment a little bit on it. So the whole process of collecting the references and also going through them, there's been a lot of comparison of like how the contrast should be, and what's important about this font is that it has a high contrast, and it was a distillation process of different sources. So there is no particular source for that, but you, of course, you can feel that someone looked into the Western sources, but at the same time, we're really trying to avoid this Western gaze on what designers behind the Iron Curtain try to do, because of course you can say, hey, it was like mimicking, or some would say it was a mimicking, or like, oh, poor people were trying to entertain themselves with this Western, with the poor illustrations of available they had at their hands to recreate something. But I think there is a lot of things that are really unique to these magazines. We are not really showing them in detail, but just this comparison of this cloud of forms we are meditating over. And so, yeah, this biennial, back then it was a COVID or a post-COVID time, and the designer made pretty good use of it. Wolfgang Schwärzler did this, and so these are a few more examples of how it was implemented. Now, the same area at Lukyanivka, there is also a house standing some 150 meters away from that building that was previously shown, and actually, paradoxically wise, or funnily, not Russia destroys Ukrainian heritage, but also its own traces in Ukraine, because this building, Mala Opera, it actually belongs to the so-called Russian style. Something you would see a lot, like, for example, the cathedral on the Red Square is like this, more or less the same architectural style. And so this image on the left is it comes from the, I would say, mid-80s. I don't know exactly when it was taken, but here a little back jump into this calligraphy, but another story of another phase or side story of this calligraphy in USSR, which was also quite common for movie theaters and theaters, because it was like financially it was more convenient for them to hire someone graduated from the art school, not art university, but there's been bursa. Well, how do you call bursa or in English? Like not the higher design education, but rather applied design education. There have been a lot of such schools around around the city, and these people were trained to also do lettering. So they've been trained to do to be all-rounders. So many of them were skilled to do monumental, well, not monumental work, but to decorate, to design points of sale for the supermarkets. And some of them were paid by theaters, where like had part-time jobs to design these programs. And as you know, back in the days, the programs were quite frequent. These things had to be produced really fast, and the whole dynamic style of this lettering appeared. And I was thinking that it died out until Andrei Sherbina, a friend of us, said to me, "Hey, go to the house of the cinema." And this is the image on the right that depicts a charming cafe at the lobby of this building, where that really recreates. I mean, it keeps the spirit of the 90s, where there is a lady, an older lady preparing a coffee for you with a Turkish coffee cooker. And what else? And of course, the lobby is full of this stuff. And so Oleś previously have been talking about preserving this legacy. So for us, not only drawing would mean preserving, but it's still we keep this idea in our minds to work with this guy who is actually, I mean, I have his phone number, and he's still producing. Well, back when Andrei showed me this place, he was active. I don't know how about the wartime, but quite interesting that they keep this that this house stores, this house hosts someone keeping this craft alive. Quite funny, the image on the right, on the bottom right, communicates through the means of through the analog means of a brush. It communicates our digital world, which is this Facebook group of the House of the Cinema. Now, let's move a little bit further away from Lukyanivka and go to Zhelyanska Street. It's not far away. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was targeted by Russians because close to it, there is a power plant. There was a heating plant station, formerly known as TETS-1. Quite an interesting constructivist or post-constructivist building, I would say, that was in the 90s, not a power plant anymore, but a heating plant. I'm sure the missile was targeted to targeted there, but unlike they say or they claim to have high precision weapons, I mean, I don't care. I mean, it's all destruction. The missile hit this building, where unfortunately a pregnant woman was inside and died. And so when I was researching about this building, many things came together during this research. Well, first of all, you see that this is a 3D rendering. And on the top, there is a map, there is a link. Sasha, if you could, you please copy paste it in the chat. It would be nice for people. It would be good for people to browse this 3D maps as they recreate the devastation and the destruction made by Russian army in 3D models, which was done by a Japanese geographer. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but I'm sure you will find out. And so he was, with the help of some enthusiasts, some local enthusiasts, he made it pretty much into the detailed 3D renderings. And so up until I was looking at this building, you can rotate it, up until I discovered this brick. Now, this brick belongs to the manufacturer called Reiche, and obviously the house that we see also is quite typical for the turn of the century, so late 19th, early 20th century, built by what also quite typical for that time by a Jewish entrepreneur. You may know that Jews were not allowed to live in the city, in certain areas. They were allowed to live in the certain areas of the city, especially like Oleś knows it, especially in Podil district, like this was a Jewish area, for example. But like the upper to the hills, only wealthy people were able to live. So you must have had, you should have you should have been a wealthy man to allow to yourself to live in the city. And so this house was built by a Jewish entrepreneur, and many of them were producers of bricks, not Reiche, but this guy called Iona Markovich Zaitsev. I mean, Reiche sounds rather German to me. And then I found out that, and you know, among these bricks, I mean, there's a whole topic of this brick research in Kyiv, and also this is a phenomena that you see across Europe, and I'm sure in the United States too. But when I was researching about these bricks, I mean, here's Reiche and here is IMZ, saying Iona, abbreviation standing for Iona Mordkovich Zaitsev. And now, who was this Zaitsev? Zaitsev was an employer of the man whose name is widely known in the whole world. He was employing the man called Baylis. And Baylis, you may be familiar with this case, and for those who don't know, there was a big trial in 1911, plotted by some right-wingers. Back then, Kyiv and Ukraine was part of Russian Empire, and so there was. It's not a secret that anti-Semitism was already brewing inside the reactionary circles, but also in within the rural folks. And so this group of people that were involved in the city council and in the politics, they facilitated this case of accusing this Jewish employee of Iona Mordkovich Zaitsev, this man called Baylis, accused for murdering a Ukrainian guy. They said this back then. They said a Russian Orthodox innocent boy for the ritual, to drink his blood, for the Easter ritual, for one of the Pesach Easter days. So he was accused for that. he, of course, he didn't. It's a part of this whole anti-Semitic narrative that was emerging, and here we see the roots of the big exodus of the Jewish of the Yiddish culture, which was previously part of Kyiv landscape, which is not existing anymore, but. We are really interested also in this field, and I mean, historically, it was a part of the culture. There's been a lot of there was a huge Jewish community in Kyiv and in Ukraine, and you can't imagine Ukraine without Jews, you know. And this image in particular. It shows an early work of Lazar Lisitsky, who was not a Ukrainian Jew, but he was involved in the Ukrainian movement, but actually not only Ukrainian, but it had its quarter in Kyiv, where he, as a young architect graduate coming from Germany, was active in this cult, artistic group called Kulturliga, and this image is an illustration made by Lisitsky, who was then fond of Yiddish culture and motivated to bring it into the new light using modern approach, modern illustration. So he was actually illustrating here the children's book called Hadgadia, and it's a beautiful children's book, very hard to find. I'm sure connoisseurs of Judaica know about it. And so what's interesting about this image is it's kind of a forerunner of what later became the icon of like the avant-garde, and that was faulty for some faulty reasons, and also for some imperial reasons claimed to be called as Russian avant-garde. And we have to be really careful with this combination, because avant-garde is the worldwide phenomena, and it's when talking Russian avant-garde, quite often critics they made Ukrainian avant-garde artists as being part of Russian avant-garde and as being part of this big narration. So this appropriation was always a big case, or a big problem, I would say. Now, that so far about the Bailey's case and the Jewish trace. Now, it's sad enough, but the whole research about this building ended up, for me, was this list of people who were exterminated in Babin Yar in Kyiv. I mean, it's also part of the history of the Holocaust. So this exodus. So after the Bailey's case, after pogrom, many Jews left Kyiv. But then, like my grandfather and his parents, they said, well, we see, Soviets came to power. They saw some future in it, and they stayed in Kyiv. Now, my grandfather, he and his family, neither him nor his family knew about what was about to come with Germans. But perhaps they had some gut feelings for, to be evacuated early enough. And they've been evacuated in 1941, shortly after Kyiv been shelled bombed by the Germans. But some didn't leave Kyiv. And 500,000 of Kyiv, of the Jews living in Kyiv was exterminated in the place called Babin Yar. And so to close this circle, to close this very tragic circle of this research about this house, you remember I said about this pregnant woman who was killed inside, and the house was built by a Jewish entrepreneur. Now that I was searching for Zhelyanska 116, I found out that there was a Jewish guy called Beilman Avram Avseyevich who was also killed in Babin Yar. Now, of course, there is a connection to this place, so Lukyanivka, Zhelyanska, then the Babi Yar, because from Lukyanivka, from Zhelyanska, they've been forced. On one day, they said to them they had to collect their belongings and to leave their houses, and they've been their roads to death. And the final point was here. So the TV tower that was attacked another day is standing in the historical area of Babin Yar, where 600,000 of Kyiv Jews were killed, but also war prisoners and some civilians too. Russians attacked, by the way, this, hit this TV tower. Their argument was that, they had to do it because of Ukraine spreading misinformation about this war. And so you get an idea. This is the famous picture from Babin Yar. Now, there have been Jews like my granddad who returned to Kyiv after the evacuation, and also other Soviet Jews who then came to Kyiv, and apparently they didn't find any neighbors. They found an empty city. Like their people of their ethnicity, they didn't find them. They've been all gone. And so in 1966, there was a big gathering in Babin Yar, and this is a typographical evidence, the only typographical evidence, I would say, of this gathering. It was not officially, it was forbidden for Jews to commemorate in official way these events. And even though the official propaganda was saying the whole the whole Soviet Union population suffered, and then there was a big discussion around the monument that had to be erected on that place, and the party line was always, but there's been all of us who suffered under this in these tragic events, but I mean, you see where it leads. There was a certain suppression of the ethnic memory, or the memory of the whole ethnic part of the city, and even though it was forbidden, they gathered, and this meeting was closed down by the KGB, but there is evidence that it happened, and ever since there have been people writing about it, and there have been people fighting for the justice to come, and finally this justice came after Ukraine has become independent in 1991, where the official monument was then erected, and at this point, it's worth mentioning our collaboration with Matan Iontiev, an Israeli designer who who works and who completed his design for compact, KTF compact, one of our releases. So it's done. It's to be released very soon. As to link, this Yiddish Jewish tradition with also the Yiddish heritage, and also to bring it, to place it within the context of multi-scriptural world, and really not only being focused on Cyrillic. Now coming to the end, the last one I'm showing is the building that was shelled on the second day of the full-scale invasion. There was a big explosion. This drone that was shut down was full of fuel that made this house burn. And on that day, I sent an email to a person who I considered the one and the only, design critic on the post-Soviet ground, Vladimir Krychevsky. And I showed this image to him, and he reacted to it as following. He said that he's really troubled, and he's really sorry for that. And in my email, I've sent this image to him, and I wrote that, this is what Russia does to Ukraine now. And in the end of the email, he writes to me back, "Aren't you naive to believe that Russia actually attacked Ukraine first?" And so much about Russian criticism in design history. And as Sasha said in his introduction, there is always, there has been this phrase going on, I keep myself out of politics. I don't want to be too political, but it's impossible, and it just doesn't work. Now this house, term Spalny Rayon, which is a sleeping neighborhood, as places where people sleep, is really far away. But it's there is a little positive story about it. As living in a megapolis, and I consider Kyiv as a megapolis, you hardly ever leave your neighborhood, and especially in the childhood. And for New York, it's more obvious that the distance plays a big role in building a certain psychogeographical, a certain feeling for the city. And sometimes you could live in a certain area without leaving it, and without even knowing what's happening on the opposite side. And Kharkivska, where this building stands, is like one of my first childhood memories, where I was at my grandma's. She's still alive. She's in Hanover. She's been evacuated from Kyiv. And it was freshly built, like newly erected, 1994. Somehow she got to know that this metro station was done. She told me about it. And I was like, as a little boy, I was like, yeah, let's go there. And she was, I didn't expect from her to go there, because it's like it takes a lot of time to come from Vidradny to Kharkivska, and she did it. And I'm really grateful for her to take this drift that actually inspires the structure of the lecture, to take this digital drift through the city of Kyiv. And I'm thankful to her. And here's the little reminder of that, this lettering coming from the 90s. And then there are other things to discover in the 2000s we're also interested in, because obviously, it seems that we, as young adults, we spent our times in the 90s and 2000s. They seem to be not so far away, but it's like time. We feel like the times have come, like to also deal with the 90s and 2000s. And at this point, I would say thank you very much for listening. We're at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you a lot.
Right.
Thank you, guys. Let me just rearrange this, make it visible. Okay. So hopefully you guys can see the screen. First of all, thank you, Yevgen, Oleś. It's a fantastic and really heartfelt, and of course complicated and difficult. So I appreciate the emotional weight that this obviously conjures up. It's hard not to watch and not feel affected. I appreciate your ability to kind of to take us on this journey that for you, of course, both is complex, and I think for the world and of course everyone watching. So thank you for that, and for a really interesting, nuanced way to think about material, especially kind of typographic material and history. So we're gonna take a few moments to take questions. So for folks who are watching, feel free to send questions in the Q&A window. We'll be reading through those, and we can kind of talk about those. And maybe I'll start with a few questions I kind of have in terms of just my own thinking and my own shaping and reshaping of ideas. And I say reshaping in a very kind of intentional way, because I think I share a similar background to both of you in my heritage and sort of my physical birth, of course, is in Ukraine, in Odessa, and very much like a cosmopolitan city, much like Kyiv, a much smaller scale, of course, maybe less of a magnet for the creatives, the way that St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kyiv were, but certainly kind of an important place, and a very heavily of course, Russian speaking and Russian centric in terms of culture. And so, one of the things that I'm discovering in terms of my own heritage and in terms of my own education, this idea of kind of the nuances of context and the nuances of avant-garde. And I appreciate it, Yevgen, like you kind of made a specific mention. I think it's a really important notion to restate this idea of like avant-garde being a global and an international idea, not necessarily created and owned by one place. I think that there's this like oversimplification, I would say even like a slippage into taking something quite complex and flattening into as one place, like the Soviet, or in most cases the Russian avant-garde, which again, like even semantically becomes very important to this day. So I wonder if you guys can maybe talk about sort of what this unfortunate violent conflict has, how has it shaped and like, what would you say maybe surprised you in terms of the history that you're finding now? Anything that you could share for the audience in terms of what you've discovered that has changed the way you think about Soviet avant-garde, the way you think about international avant-garde, the way you think about constructivism, about the history of Ukrainian art and the Ukrainian avant-garde? I know it's a very kind of broad question, but it's something that I've been thinking about and kind of curious what your experience has been.
What do you want?
Yeah, I would just put it briefly that this war shows us that we didn't pay much attention to the destinies of those designers, especially when we go to the museum. Usually we have this attribute like a Russian avant-gardist in like the worst scenario, and like it's better than it's put just Soviet avant-garde designer. But overall, we lack that story about the destiny, the fate of those designers who were executed by the Soviet totalitarian regime. And if some designers didn't even suffer physically their legacy suffered, and their style suffered as well, because lots of designers just were made to change their techniques even, and to change their styles. So the new styles that were more favorable by the government should be seen to the people. And those kind of oppression practices have to be reconsidered right now and recontextualized in the context of this war.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, there's because of the brand of the Russian avant-garde or the avant-garde, it's quite often treated quite superficially. It's been celebrated as being some kind of a festival, but in fact, when you go back to 1927, like it's a really, like on the timeline, when you see like how many years in comparison to the Stalin's regime and afterwards, like how actually how short this period was, and how much of a hope for the young revolutionaries it offered, and how tragically they ended. I see it as a reason enough to start a conversation about. And I mean, within the festival of of this celebration of avant-garde, that I think it should be also seen not only as some kind of a gimmick, but rather as a material to reflect about your own history, about the generation of, as I said, the generation of grandparents and the circumstances they lived in. And I mean, we live in a different circumstances nowadays, but it seems that somehow the history repeats itself, and the politics fail in many cases. As it's not only Russia, but I mean, there has been a big political crisis in Germany, and I think there are still there are many discourses going on that had to be taken care of.
Yeah, I think like my hope for the folks who are watching and who kind of come away with just this idea of kind of how nuanced and how complex things are, but I think your talk and the examples that you showed tied together like the real human history. I think that's often like the forgotten part, as you just said, like it's the context around these things is really important. And I hope that folks do assess and kind of evaluate the avant-garde, especially the Soviet period of avant-garde, as you said, this very kind of short, bright window, but also assess it from what was happening and why things were happening. I think that there's a lot of nuances that get lost in this admiration for the visual aesthetic, how vibrant that was and how influential it was, but like there's politics, I mean, completely, if you talk about like the link between politics and design, like the Soviet era avant-garde is completely enmeshed. It's both politics through design, and so it's this really kind of complex thing that I think there's a little bit unpacking for. And if nothing else, like maybe this is an opportunity for people to get a slightly more sensitive read on that piece of history, a very important one, but big things connect. I recently just came across this piece that it's from 1988, and for folks maybe watching might be familiar with, it's a journal, typographic journal called Visible Language. Every issue of this and every article is in PDF form. It's a fantastic piece, but it's a piece from 1988 by Shimon Boyko and Christoph Lenk, who were both at the RISD at the time, and it's this it's a discussion on the Lisitsky, who just came up, and kind of the famous For the Voice book that he collaborated with Mayakovsky's text on, and this kind of amazingly important piece of avant-garde history. It's a seminal visual, And what I appreciate about this piece, it's a quite short piece by Shimon, and what he talks about is like, one, he says it's not Lisitsky's best work. I mean, it's a subjective personal opinion, but he kind of he says that some of the more Yiddish work was a little bit more interesting and more nuanced than this particular thing. And he raises one very important thing about this, is he says, like, who is the audience for this book? You know, since the book was published in Germany, in Berlin, the audience for that book was Russian speakers living in Berlin.
Charlottenburg, yes.
So it's a, you know, it and also how violent the text itself is, you know, the how aggressive and almost universally it's a very obviously Bolshevik position, but like how there's nothing besides Bolshevism, and how, you know, it's riddled with untruths and conspiracies. So it's this very, very interesting thing that often gets a little bit lost in the mix of, like, well, one, it's in Cyrillic, and so if you're not Russian speaker, it just becomes visual, kind of avant-garde visuals, but that kind of unpacking that and reading the text and seeing kind of the complexities and who the audience was, for me, was eye-opening. I hadn't, you know, it's from '88, so we kind of, but it's an incredibly, like, small little detail that opens up a much bigger lens on such a well-known piece, that I encourage folks to kind of dig a little bit deeper and kind of look through these. I don't want to skip some of the questions we had. Matvey Maslyukov asked if, you know, based on some of the inspiration, some of the visuals you guys were showing, like, are there typefaces in the works around some of these themes, you know, in the various themes that you brought up in the talk?
I would say, yeah, Oleś, it's actually your moment to shine, or reveal your your program, your plans.
Yeah, we're still working on Ekran typeface we've shown during the presentation, and we are constantly upgrading our research with finding new scans from the magazines and from other sources like Silence as well, and the bus stops and so on. And we just right now in the process of mixing different moves and just finding the right balance for the font, and the right contrast and the widths as well. So yeah, I hope it will be released this year, at the end of this year.
The Ekran is one of the display releases, but some, you know, we've been also working on the text jobbing typeface, where we are having a lot of, like, many challenges, because this is one of the sources. You know, I was educated within this Western, within this Western type design context. So I came to work on Cyrillics after I graduated from École. So, and then during that time, I was using a lot this Italian typeface called Forma, and I was so intensively using it, so I got really used, and it was like my right nowadays it's like my Arial or whatever, like the default font, and so it permeated my working environment so much. So I started researching, okay, how could I design its Cyrillic counterpart, and to I mean, the source is Italian, but the model for it, there are many crossovers with what Viktor Harek in Kyiv has done with his early Helvetica tryouts or attempts, even though nowadays you would say it was quite boring. But I worked with him, and this is the typeface that is to be released definitely in 23. And so, yeah, Matvey, to answer your question, one jobbing typeface as a family, not a super family, but as a family of 4 cuts, and we're working on it with our intern Vadim, who is in Ukraine. And yeah, so the starting point for this serialization of it was actually working with Viktor Harik, who is one of the like older masters in Ukrainian type design scene, who also made a transition to the digital, and that's why we could work on the. So he was drawing things himself. Yeah, that's amazing that he was drawing on Font Lab. So we've been actually doing this ping pong of we generated OTFs, and we opened I opened OTFs and was working in glyphs and forth. And there is a bunch of displays are coming out. The version of Eric Gill's Gill Ultra, the very Cyrillic interpretation of it. So no ascenders, no descenders, really like X height. But of course with Latin, totally the opposite, with a lot of ascending and descending elements. The first month of the revenue of this font will be donated to volunteers in Ukraine. This is the initial plan, and then of course the updates. So as I showed, compact Hebrew, Yermilov Georgian. There is a Georgian designer, Akaki Razmadzde, who helped me out extending Yermilov within Georgian script, and yeah, there's plenty of stuff to come. I mean, the war obviously paused us. We've been obviously occupied with other stuff and been shocked for a while, and but now type design is in the making again.
Yeah, it's hard to stop creativity, and I think again, like as I said kind of in the beginning, there's a very concerted effort by Russia to erase a very particular culture, and I think it's just proves how resilient culture often is, and it's as your talk very eloquently showed, how much stays and how much is still there, even if things that unfortunately get destroyed, but there's still a lot of history and still a lot of things to be discovered and unpacked. And I think what I really appreciate too is the way that you both linked both sort of your experience of the outside world and kind of your visual and kind of using that as a place to explore and create projects that are formally interesting, but also historically are meaningful, and leave kind of a link to that past. And I appreciate that just as a really interesting way of looking at making type and making type today, and making type in a very complex environment that we're living in. And it's very easy, which is often the hope of the aggressor, is to just make that not accessible and not fun, and just the sheer trauma that this is creating. But I think to maintain a creativity and kind of leaving a lasting impact and creating even breadcrumbs for others to see is incredibly vital right now. I think Ukrainian culture is incredibly resilient and will survive and will be victorious in the end. I think we shall see that, and I wholeheartedly believe in that. The truth and the right in this case will persevere. So I really appreciate both of you continuing to make this work, first and foremost. Secondly, for your time and sharing your insight again in the challenging period emotionally for both of you. So dėkui, Oleś and Yevgen, thank you so much for presenting this wonderful talk, and I hope that folks watching this have come away with something, and they feel free to reach out to us, and hopefully kind of stay in touch, but certainly keep this talk and watch this. And I'm so grateful for us to kind of put this lecture together and get this out to the world and let people see it. And again, continue to make this wonderful work. Yeah, we will win.
Thank you. Amen. Amen.
Exactly.
Thank you. Дякую. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, folks, for the passions, for listening to this very important lecture.
Дякую. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.